Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this exclusive interview. Slovakia's political landscape has been thrust into the spotlight following Prime Minister Robert Fico's recent meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The talks focused on energy and the Ukraine conflict have drawn sharp criticism across Europe and sparked protests in Bratislava. As Slovakia's foreign policy direction faces growing scrutiny, questions arise about its implications for EU unity and domestic stability. Joining us to discuss these developments is Ivan Korčok, former Slovak Minister of Foreign and European Affairs and 2024 presidential candidate. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thanks for having me, and good afternoon.
So first, can you help us interpret Prime Minister Fico's decision to meet President Putin, given the current geopolitical tensions?
Well, I tried to explain a little bit what happened before he traveled to Moscow. Namely, he participated together with other member states of the European Union at the summit in Brussels. And there he tried to get support of member states for continuing the transit of gas via Ukraine. And he suffered, and the Prime Minister of Slovakia suffered a major blow where basically nobody has supported him. And he had a major conflict with President Zelensky. And instead of trying to convince them how it is important for Slovakia to continue this transit of gas via Ukraine, he traveled to Moscow. And for me, it is absolutely understandable move by him, which only confirms a very much changed attitude of his government of Prime Minister Fico, who is basically politically saying that Ukraine has no chance winning this war, that at the end of the day, Ukraine will have to abandon its territory, and basically where Prime Minister Fico is criticizing Western European allies and members of European Union and NATO for providing military support, which he interprets only prolongs the war. So this was the context. And he traveled to Moscow, which I cannot understand because you cannot ensure transit via Ukraine by negotiating with Putin. So this was just a pretext for him to travel to Moscow. And basically, that's a very sad moment for Slovakia. He's joining Prime Minister of Hungary, Orban, and now the two are playing a Trojan horses of Kremlin in European Union and NATO.
Right, you mentioned something important here, the transit through Ukraine. However, he decided to go and negotiate with the Russian president, which is a little bit perplexing. And I think even Russian officials have been saying that without Ukraine's agreement, this kind of transit is actually, well, very tricky to carry out. What exactly is he trying to achieve here? Is this also a political play? Are there anything else outside of just the gas that he's going after?
Well, exactly. Because once again, everybody understands if you want to ensure the transit via Ukraine, you cannot travel to Moscow. And he has known that President Zelensky is opposing the continuation of gas transit via Ukraine for months. But instead of trying to engage with him, he has carried out a very hostile rhetoric against President Zelensky. I can share with you some of his claims of Prime Minister Fico, where he said that there is no war in Kiev, that there is no life. He said that there's fascist government in Ukraine, and basically he was siding more and more with President Putin. So you're rightly pointing to the fact that that was a political game for him, and it has had a very important domestic dimension for Prime Minister Fico, because he is quite successful in maintaining a deep political division within the country. We are a divided society. A very large portion of Slovaks are supporting Ukraine. However, and sadly, a very large portion of Slovak population is supporting Russia in this aggression against Ukraine. So it has had a very important domestic motivation for Prime Minister Fico.
Right. And speaking of this domestic and international divide, do you think that, well, you mentioned earlier there's an issue with negotiation when it comes to Fico going to Brussels. Were there any chance at any point where there could have been a more kind of negotiable position that the Prime Minister could have taken instead of having to go all the way to Moscow to discuss the energy transit? Or do you think the whole topic about Ukraine opening its pipeline is off the table since day one anyways?
Well, unfortunately, I think that what Prime Minister Fico did after this summit in Brussels, where he literally received no support by member states, he unfortunately destroyed and closed the opportunities of avenues for a negotiated deal where once again Slovakia, that's a matter of fact, is losing a huge amount of money which we have been receiving for transit, which is leading through our country to the west. So it is a politically calculated move by Prime Minister Fico. We are criticizing him heavily for him because he has served the purpose of Russian propaganda, where President Putin, siding, with or showing up together with Prime Minister Fico, can say now I'm not alone, because there are countries like Slovakia, like Hungary, who are not supporting Ukraine, and the West is divided. So there is a damage for Slovakia when it comes to the important transit route, but politically it's a major damage for Slovak Republic's foreign policy reputation.
All right. When it comes to, you mentioned losing money earlier, the Slovakian government now has published a number saying that losing the transit of Russian gas through Ukraine will cost a country about 2,020 million euros just in transit alone. Do you think that's good enough of an argument to try to continue to procure its gas from Russia through Ukraine? Or do you think energy independence is something perhaps higher on top of the agenda list than perhaps this large sum of number that we're looking at?
I mean, energy independence matters. We've seen Russians that they've been playing this card of, energy and raw materials deliveries. That's a geopolitical weapon for them. And we haven't learned the lesson from 2009 when they stopped deliveries of gas to Slovakia. And since then, instead of decreasing our dependence on Russian deliveries, we kept on buying cheap Russian gas. Here, let me say as well, we were not alone in this naivety, if you want, but also Nord Stream 2 has basically supported this position of Prime Minister Fico, who could have pointed to the West and say, well, they are buying cheap Russian gas, we are buying cheap Russian gas as well. But you cannot make a trade-off between what is the major tragedy of Ukraine and aggression, where Russia is trying to deprive Ukraine of its very existence and trade off basically the existence of our neighbor with cheap gas. This is absolutely unacceptable.
Right, but there are still a lot of countries that heavily rely on Russian gas for its energy when it comes to the entire infrastructure, be it Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, to name one. Are there any plans by EU partners and EU members to help perhaps alleviate some of these costs or some of these energy crises in order for them to stave off the Russian energy?
Well, I should be more diplomatic. I don't want to be diplomatic. I spent in diplomacy 30 years now in politics, and I want to say that there is a lot of hypocrisy, not only in the countries which you have mentioned, which are dependent on deliveries of Russian gas, but there are Western countries as well. I was astonished when data were published, I think even this week, and they have shown that the gas deliveries of Russian LNG gas have increased over this year to Western countries. So we have not done enough simply to decrease this dependency of Russian gas deliveries, and we see that Russians are playing with that. In case of Slovakia, at this particular moment, however, it is not a problem for us that we would not have enough gas, because we have ensured that we have enough in our storages. The problem is the economic costs of us losing the transit route via Slovakia. But we have to understand one thing, which obviously Prime Minister Fico doesn't want to understand, that it is unacceptable politically for President Zelensky to further basically allow transit for Russian gas to Western Europe, and by that allow Russians to use money which Russia is receiving for funding the aggressive war against Ukraine. So there is politics in it. But indeed, we have lost momentum since 2009, at least, when there was this gas crisis, and we haven't done enough to decrease our dependency on Russian gas, and we are paying price for that.
Right, and you mentioned earlier that a lot of countries are still reliant on Russian energy, or at least not just for energy, but to prop up its own economy, which, we've seen, have you mentioned before. Do you think that Fico's action would actually embolden other EU countries to now start taking a very similar view towards Russia?
No, I don't think so. The problem with the Prime Minister's visit to Moscow is that it is coming at a very critical and important time for Ukraine, for the West, where we are mobilizing support for Ukraine so that we strengthen its position, which would allow Ukraine at the end of the day and maybe throughout the next year to sit at the table and negotiate a solution how to end the war. So the problem is timing at this moment, but I'm absolutely certain that other countries will not follow this example. What we see is rather, and unfortunately, that Slovakia has followed the example of Hungary, and now I maintain my position that we not only have Hungary as a Trojan horses, but Slovakia has joined this tandem or this duo, which is undermining European unity. But it is an existential fight for Ukraine, and it is an existential fight for the security of Europe as a whole. And we must maintain unity and not destroy it, as we have seen with Prime Minister, who once again wanted to show up side by side with President Putin. It is a betrayal of the West. It is a betrayal of Ukraine. It is a betrayal of Slovak citizens.
Right. You mentioned this is a very critical time indeed. Do you think, while making this move right now at such a critical timing might run a risk of kind of diverging from the EU position, might kind of run the risk of hitting EU's unity going into this negotiation?
Well, indeed, because this is Russian narrative that they keep on spreading when they point to Budapest, when they now point to Bratislava, and they say, well, you know, the unity of European Union and NATO is not that clear as it seems to be, because there are countries which understand Russian positions, and I'm very sorry that Slovakia is playing this role of a useful idiot who is just feeding the Russian narrative about Russia being not isolated. So that's a big problem once again.
All right, so we'll have to see how this develops. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you very much, and all the best, and Merry Christmas to all of you.
Cheers.
Thanks.
And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.